hard to know what to say to a group of seasoned ministers. A lot of what I had in mind probably be helpful for younger fellows coming on. You fellows, I need to get on a one-on-one with you and take some notes from you. You can tell me how it's done. You're probably more seasoned and experienced at this than I am by far. A couple of things I want to say. First of all, I've enjoyed working with Brother and Sister Whitaker. Brother Whitaker's my kind of song leader. I decided I really like this fellow. I have a lot in common. For number one, he likes the same kind of songs I do. That always helps. And he's telling us about his favorite songs, and boy, I say amen to that. Those are my favorite songs too, if we can share that. I sort of sprung it on him last night singing that Come O Thou Traveler Unknown, or Wrestling Jacob, but he held up well through it. He wasn't familiar with the song. Didn't the people sing that well last night? How many of you knew that song, by the way? A couple of you had. Notice it's not the young people who have their hands up, it's the older ones. You know, I was gratified for the comments from the young people last night. College students said, wow, I never heard a song like that. And they had their copy with them, so we will find those other 17 verses, you know, the total of 17 verses. Many times I've taken that song and others like it and just crawled off in the corner of my study, got down on my face before God and wept as I read through those lines. I'll tell you, that stuff is rich. It'll feed you. It makes a lot of the contemporary stuff just seem like foam and chaff and froth. Oh, there's so much I'd like to say to you today. Our brother just said something about the Jews. I'm amazed at how much anti-Semitism is around, even in fundamentalist circles. I don't know where people's brains are. A lady in my church subscribed to a paper called The Spotlight. It looked pretty conservative, and this was years ago at my first pastorate. This paper started coming to the parsonage, and the first, it was about a 4 or 6 sheet, small newspaper format. And always the first 2 pages were nothing but blatant anti-Semitism. You know, you'd have thought a bunch of Arabs were publishing this thing. The rest of it sounded like fundamentalist preaching. You know, let me just take a moment and look at Genesis chapter 12 with you and verse 3. In case you don't know it, you need to know what God said to Abraham. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. God calls him, he said to him that he was going to make of him a great nation. Verse 2 says, And I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Notice verse 3, I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now what makes that verse come alive? There are 3 different Hebrew words that are all translated curse. There is the word, the first word is the word which simply means to be light. It comes from the verb which means to be light. It means to speak lightly of. If you've ever noticed in Job chapters 1, 2, and the first verse of verse 3, there's a lot of talk about curses in there. Satan says, if you do this, he'll curse you. And the challenge is thrown out, and Job says he was afraid that his sons might have cursed God. The word curse appears numerous times in those first 3 chapters. Most of the time, it comes from the verb which means to be light. For example, in Job 3:1, it says, After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed his day. It's not the word that you and I think of. It simply means to speak lightly of, to be light, to speak lightly of. It doesn't carry the connotation of the heavy curse. There's another word for that. There's a second word which is a little bit confusing. It can mean to bless or to curse. The word actually means, you know, have you ever had somebody walk up to you and you talk a little bit and you say goodbye? You say, well, the Lord bless you. We say it all the time, don't we? When Job says his sons were feasting with his daughters, their sisters, and he said they might have cursed God, it's the second word. There he says they may have said, well, goodbye, God. You know, the Lord bless you. We'll see you. It's the second usage of the word. And then the third word is the word which means what you and I normally think of. It's the heavy curse. When God does it, I tell my students, that's when God drops the hammer on you, whatever that means. That's the heavy curse. And taking that little thumbnail sketch of those 2 words in Genesis 12:3, what he's saying is I will bless them that bless thee, and I will do the heavy curse on those that merely speak lightly of you. That's exactly what that verse means. Friend, be careful what you say about God's chosen people. Just speak lightly of them, and you place yourself in jeopardy where God will put a heavy curse on you. We're to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. God has a special relationship with the Jews. They are the ones through whom he wanted to introduce the Messiah to the world. Unfortunately, they dropped the ball, and he had to turn to the Gentiles. But I'm always troubled when I hear people making fun of the Jews or knocking them. Well, there are several things I'd like to say to you today. First of all, I'd like to just say to you, preachers, men, magnify your office. God has placed a high calling on your life. I can't think of a more important position that a man could find himself in than to be a minister of the gospel. William McKinley was the 25th President of the United States. He was from the state of Ohio. William McKinley was raised in a Methodist home. Several times I've been in the church downtown Canton, Ohio, where he attended church. He was a member of it's called the Church of the Savior, United Methodist Church today. His seat has a special covering on it where he would sit regularly. He ran for the Ohio State House, and he won. And when word came to his mother, they said, "Oh, Mother, Mrs. McKinley, your boy has just been elected to the State House." Well, she said, "That's fine," but she said, "My boy might have been a Methodist preacher." Then later he was elected to be governor of the state of Ohio. It was a hard-fought contest, and he won. And again, eventually word gets to his mother. They said, "Well, congratulations, Mrs. McKinley. Your son has been elected governor of the state of Ohio." Well, she said, "That's nice," but she said, "My boy might have been a Methodist preacher." You know what's coming next. Then he's elected President of the United States. She's an old lady now. Word is brought to her, "Your son's just been elected the President of the United States." Oh, she said, "He might have been a Methodist preacher." I think she had things in perspective, don't you? Magnify your office. I have problems with people who call their pastor or his wife by their first name. Now, I know that's not in vogue today. The young people make a big deal out of it. "Oh, I'm Pastor Bob, or I'm Pastor Jim." I always tell my students at the college, don't let them call you by your first name, nor your wife either. She's your partner. You know what I call my pastor? Now, my pastor at home, I go to a little country church. It's a Western Methodist church, and he's a former student of mine. I never call him by his first name. He's always our pastor. If I'm praying for him, I pray for our pastor. In fact, when I visit my nephew, I never call him by his first name in front of his people. He's always the pastor. I call my pastor's wife Madam Pastor. It comes from the Haitian mission field. "Good morning, Madam Pastor." I know she likes that. I wouldn't have to do that. She's a fraction of my age, Her husband's a former student of mine. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to help him to magnify his office. I think that's essential. We were moving into our second church that we pastored. Several of the people there knew my wife and me from the time we were younger. Well, they knew me. And they had a habit of calling their pastor by his first name. So they came up to my wife, one of the ladies did, the night we were still out unloading the van. And she got her aside and said, "What should we call you?" And my wife said, "Mrs. Kaufman will be just fine." She didn't like that. She was hoping it would be her first name, but it wasn't. You got to start them off right, too. It's hard to change something once the habit is set. So magnify your office. A couple of things I wanted to say also. We have ministerials to edify and encourage one another, not just for preaching and Bible study. I've told you about some of the ministerials I've attended. Hopefully we'll get some ideas that might help us to be more effective in our work as ministers of the gospel. I ran across this several months ago, and I jotted it down, and I wanted to share it with you. It's the definition of insanity. Listen to this. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Think about that. Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Now, do you know who said that? Benjamin Franklin. Not a holiness preacher. Why, he says it's insane. If you do the same thing and never change it, then why do you expect to do, why do you expect a different outcome? That's insanity. And I thought of us, we sit and wring our hands, we're not growing or whatever, and we talk about, oh, me, and yet we don't change a thing, but somehow we think it's going to change on its own. Why, that's insanity. Then another fellow one time said there are 3 possible dispositions of a minister. He can either shine, recline, or whine. Shine, recline, and I've met a few of those. I've had some revival meetings for something like that. Even, you always put your best foot forward when the evangelist comes to town. But even sometimes you can't help but make a few observations. And then there are those who whine. They play what I call the ain't it awful game. They tell me how awful it is. Most of them are good enough not to tell me about church problems, which I don't want to know about when I'm trying to preach a meeting. And I've had a few that have come to me after the last service on Sunday night and say, oh, good, now that the pressure's off, I want to tell you a few things and ask you for some advice. Well, I appreciate that rather than jumping on me the first night I get into town, try to tell me about all their problems. All right, the message this morning, or the lecture, the talk, what is this? I'm not sure. I've entitled this, Balancing Ministerial Duties with Domestic Responsibilities. Balancing ministerial duties with domestic responsibilities. The scripture that comes to mind is 1 Kings 20, verse 40, and you know it, you don't need to look at it. It says, and as thy servant was busy here and there, he was gone. As thy servant was busy here and there, he was gone. He was assigned a certain responsibility, a task to perform, but he got busy here and there, and time got away from him. The man escaped. Idleness is the devil's workshop, but so is busyness if we fail in our main calling. The lack of balance between ministerial and domestic duties has been the undoing of many otherwise good men, and I could cite you several examples of this. You need to balance between work and play, study and rest, prayer versus calling, input versus output, that is what a man takes into himself as well as what he gives out. Let's start with the business of calling. Some men are good at calling, others are mediocre, some I wonder how they have any success at all trying to call on people. Everybody has a different way of going about it. The man that I followed on my second church, I told you had been there 43 or 44 years. I asked him one time how he got so many calls in. Now, calls are important. I saw on a table out here where somebody wants to know how many calls you make a year, or how many services you preached in, and so forth. The conference officials are interested in statistics. I think some people go calling just to meet the statistics. Now, there are all ways of doing this, I understand. Some people say that if you wave at somebody, that's a contact. If they wave back, that's a call. I was riding with my brother-in-law one time up in near the city of Erie, Pennsylvania, and he saw a couple of people waved at him, and he waved at them and turned to me and said, that's 2. He was just trying to be funny, but that's how it works, I guess. All of that reminds me of the fellow who had survived the Johnstown flood. 1889 was that awful. I used to drive through Johnstown on my way to Stoneboro Camp when I lived in Maryland. And they have a museum. Tremendous damage that was done. And they had a subsequent flood, by the way. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, there was one. I drove through sections where the road was washed out, nothing but a guardrail hanging out in the middle of nowhere. I saw railroad cars piled up in a heap. That's an awesome sight. I have pictures of that. And they said that flood wasn't anything like the one in 1889. So this fellow survives the Johnstown flood, and he loved to talk about it. And when he got to heaven, he wanted to tell the people in heaven all about how he survived the Johnstown flood. And he kept mentioning this to key people, hoping. So finally they said, well, all right, we want to hear your story. We'll put you on the program right after a fellow named Noah. It seems like every time I do my statistical report, I always follow some guy named Noah. Mine always looks rather meager. Now, I asked this fellow that I followed, I said, how do you do so many calls? Well, he said, I do whistle stops. That's his word. He never spent more than 15 minutes when he did a call. I couldn't function like that. For me, I got to take my family and spend 2 or 3 hours there. That's how I did my calls. You say you probably didn't get too many. No, I didn't. It's just whatever works for you, what gets the job done. Now, by the way, let me tell you something. You can't argue with success. If it's working, you can't stand there and say, well, it's not working. If it is, you can't argue with success. He was successful his way. I was somewhat successful my way, and yet our ways were opposite. So you have to do what works for you. You have to learn the language of the people. Boy, I'm getting more and more out of touch with the youth of today. I don't know what half the words mean that we hear nowadays. I said something to someone just the other day. We were in a meeting in North Carolina with the New York Pilgrim Church, and I said something to a lady, and she said, cool. I'm just, to me, that means to lower the temperature, you know, but she didn't have temperature in mind at all. We use different language. Those of us who are older are getting farther and farther behind, aren't we? It is a problem. S.I. Emery tells about a service they had one night in a church in Michigan. I think he was pastoring then. He may have been the evangelist. But I remember the story well. He said a fella came in off the streets, sat down in the church, and somebody was preaching. It might have been Brother Emery was preaching. Anyhow, they gave an altar call, and this fella came to the altar. And the men of the church gathered around to pray with him. Typical altar service. And someone started slapping him on the back, told him to pray through. The fellow sobered up and stood up, and he said, look, you guys, he said, I didn't come in here looking for a fight. He said, if you guys want to fight, come on. You know, and he put up his fists. He didn't like him slapping him on the back. He wasn't used to that approach. Well, we do it all the time, do anything about it. But some people aren't used to that. And then was my old pastor tells the story of the mother of the little boy who was coming to school, Sunday school, came fairly regularly. He stopped by the home one day, and the mother said, I don't like your tactics down at that church of yours. She said, if you want the kids to come to Sunday school, that's one thing, but don't threaten them like that. And he wondered, what in the world is this lady talking about? And he racked his brain, and he finally figured out they had announced that if you missed a couple of Sundays, you would be dropped from the register. And in those days, under the hot air register was the furnace. And she thought, the boy went home and said, if I miss any Sundays, they're going to throw me in the furnace. Fear tactics. Going to be dropped from the register. Well, I could cite you some other examples, but you understand what I'm trying to say. In calling, you can't call on your favorite 5 or your favorite 4 people. You've got to treat everybody equally. Don't think your congregation won't pick up on that very quickly. You start spending too much time with one family, while you give short shrift of your time to another. What is the goal of calling anyhow? Why do we call? Well, we want to meet new people. Sometimes our calling is to encourage them. Sometimes it's to discipline them. Sometimes you need to talk with them on a one-on-one. Sometimes it's to develop a sense of accountability in them. Any one of those could be overarching factors on why we go out calling. Sometimes, I made the statement last night, or maybe it was yesterday, I don't like to discuss standards with people who have no grace in their heart. Now, some people say, now, you need to shell the wood, you know, get up there behind that pulpit and let them have it. It's never been my style. When it comes to standards, some people are a little more advanced in their walk with the Lord, and as I sense that God is dealing with them, I would far rather deal with them on a one-on-one in their home, particularly when they start asking me questions. Now, they'll make observations. You know, you've had them come to your church, and the next time you talk to them, you say, wow, everybody, they're all a bunch of bun heads down there. Have you ever heard that one? The ladies have their hair up. I never heard it called bun heads till just in the last year or two. I guess that's common talk in some areas. When they start asking questions, and of course you deal with those questions, Sometimes I've actually held back and taken some new converts to camp meeting. I've seen some guys find somebody that's been saved for a week or two, and they rush them off to camp meeting, and the evangelist gets up there and blasts away at them, and they get discouraged and quit. They weren't quite ready for that yet. Wow, they say, you look like a compromiser. You know, what's wrong with you? Well, I've had some that I've waited for a year or two, and when I took them, they were ready for it, and they entered in, and they thoroughly enjoyed it. That was just my style. And again, if it works, you can't argue with it. Let me give you an example. Wayne and Tina, I mentioned the other day. The first time I ever saw her was, this is the one that went biking by the church in a two-piece bikini with her baby daughter strapped on her back. This is the one that brought her children to Bible school. And they were interested in the church. They sensed that we loved them, and they early on loved us. But they didn't have the foggiest idea about standards. I was in their house one time, and I noticed a console in the living room that had a decanter and several wine glasses around it. I knew they at least used wine, probably on a social basis. They wanted to know what was wrong with wine, what was wrong with drinking. I said, well, I'll come up and talk to you about it. I spent about 4 hours in their house one night. Now, these people are not down and outers. These are intelligent people. They're members of the big Baptist church downtown. These are people upper middle class, have a beautiful home. But they loved the church. They loved what we preached. But they just had some questions they didn't understand. I spent about 4 hours with them that night going over the 8 different Hebrew words for wine in the Bible. And I finally ended up in Proverbs, where wine is a mocker, and strong drink raging and so forth. When I was done about 10:30 or 11 that night, Wayne said, well, that settles it for us. Thank you for your time. We understand now. The next time I went back, the wine decanter and the glasses were gone, and there was no more issue about wine. They'd just never been taught about it. Well, at our camp meeting, we have the rules posted on the back of the camp meeting brochures, Old Stoneboro Camp. Now, for years, I didn't put that brochure out on the table in the vestibule where everybody could read it because somebody wasn't ready for those rules. It's about like half the conference resolutions are listed there. You give milk to the babes and strong meat to those who are of age. And so one day my older daughter, unbeknownst to me, was just helping me out. The package came in the mail, and she opened it, saw what it was, and she dropped them down on the desk out in the vestibule. And Tina picked up one and went home with it. Monday morning, the phone rang. Good morning, Pastor Kaufman. She said, I see this Stonesboro ad here. She says, I'm reading the back of it. What gives? She said, what gives? No T-shirts, no bathing suits, no whatever, went down the list. What gives? She said, oh, I'm telling you, I saw this is the end. Here it is. I said, what time does Wayne get home tonight? Oh, the usual, okay. What time will you be done with dinner? Oh, around 6. How'd be if I come up this evening? And so I went up. Well, I prayed that afternoon. I knew it was going to be a long session. I was either going to salvage this couple or I was going to lose them that night. They weren't quite ready for this. Thankfully, they did have grace in their heart, though. They'd been to the altar, they had a devotional life, they're walking in the light. This is just new stuff for them. So I sat down with them. Now, I focused on Wayne. I said, Wayne, what do you do on vacation time? Well, he said, we like to go to Atlantic City. Okay, I said, I've never been there. I said, what do you do when you go to Atlantic City? Well, you go down to the beach, you're on the ocean. Oh, okay. What do you wear when you go down to the beach? Oh, bathing suits. He starts moving around a little bit uncomfortably. And you and your wife, but yes. Now, when you're down on the beach, I said, you notice the other ladies down there, what are they wearing? Well, she's watching him. I keep focusing on him. I said, are you comfortable with what you see down there, Wayne? I said, are you comfortable with those fellows might be looking at your wife when she's wearing one of those? Well, no, he doesn't like that. I keep focusing on him as the head of the house, see? She's watching him to see what he says. And I wouldn't let up. I just kept boring in, Are you ever tempted to think anything you shouldn't? Well, it is a battle, and I just kept pressing the point home. Finally, he said, I get your drift. That was about a 4-hour session that night. But he said, Pastor, he said, you've helped us out immensely. Now, before that, when I would see him out mowing the yard, he'd have on a pair of shorts and a pair of thongs for his feet, and That's all he'd have on, maybe a pair of sunglasses. That seemed to solve the problem for them. Now, if I'd have just stood behind the pulpit and said, "You rebels who go to Atlantic City, shame on you," and just shot away at them, I'd have probably never seen them again. But I prayed about it. They were ready for it. I think God allowed my daughter to put that brochure out there. I think the timing was right, and that brought it to a head. I think it was either that year or the next year, I took a caravan of 5 loads of cars all the way from Hagerstown, Maryland to Stoneboro. It's about a 5-hour ride. And the Women's Missionary Society president, some of you know Mrs. Betty Jean Early. She used to teach at GBS. She's deceased now. She was my old English teacher in the old Salem Bible College, and she had excellent standards. I mean, what do you expect out of the president of WMS, I mean, she had tight standards. And I was up there that year with 5 loads of these people, and she caught me walking around the corner of the administration building where her office was, and I was her student. She said, "Paul," she says, "come here, I want to talk to you." She said, she said, "all these people you brought from Maryland," she said, we're impressed. She said, "Do they dress like this at home?" I said, "Mrs. Early," I said, "I'm chagrined that you would even ask me." I said, "What do you think, I got them uniforms to bring them up here?" I said, "Of course they dress this way. Why do you ask?" "Oh," she said, "we just noticed, a lot of new converts." And I said, "And they're comfortable with who they are and how they dress, too. They're not just doing this to please me." 5 carloads of them, and I didn't cram it down their throats. Now, there were some who said, "Well, I don't see it yet." I said, well, don't change just for me. When God shows it to you and you see it in His Word, then you'll own it. That'll be who you are, and you'll be comfortable with it. I said, if you just change to suit me, then I'm just a social reformer. And when your relative asks you at the family reunion why you're doing this, or the guy on the job asks you, and you say, "Well, our church does that, or our pastor feels that way." I said, "That's no reason." I said, "If I can talk you into it, somebody else can talk you out of it. So you just wait." Now, I told you I like to go out and visit the students after they graduate as a source of encouragement. Do you know what I hear again and again? They'll say to me something like this. They'll say, God's helping us to find people and we're getting them in. But they said it's like we have to win them to the Lord and then we have to win them to the church. It's like they get saved and then it's like we have to start a new cycle all over again as they are confronted with the standards. And what do we tell them? We don't know what to say. This stuff isn't in the Bible, and yet we all believe in these standards. And by the way, let me just put a little sidebar in here. I want to commend you, Midwest Pilgrims. You look like Holiness people. My wife and I have both commented since we got here. When you hold camp meetings on different campgrounds for different denominations, you can sense over the whole movement how things are going. I've been in some camp meetings where everybody from the president's wife on down have significant slits up the side of their skirts or the backs of their skirts. I expected it to get quiet. I didn't think it'd get quite this quiet, but I'm trying to compliment you. Don't sit on me. You look good. You look like Holiness people ought to. You don't look like you're weird. You don't look anything like that. You look like holy people ought to look. Just wanted to say that on the side. Now, you got so quiet, I almost lost my train of thought here. Where was I going with that, dear? Brother Sutherland, where was I going with that? Yeah, what did I last say? If I could remember, I'd know where I was going, dear. Oh, yes, thank you. Good. He was really listening. So these guys say to me, what do we say? I said, here's how it is. A man marries a woman, they set up a house. Okay, they set up a household. Father's the head of the house, but they communicate, they work together. When the children come along, Dad and Mom lay down some rules, right? Every house ought to have some rules, although I've been in some houses, I wonder if there are any rules at all. Really, it's frustrating. We were just around some young parents, and we watched them struggle with their kids. They bring them to church, and they sit there and they wrestle with these kids, and they're just in and out with them. They've got no control at all. They never cross their will. Intelligent people with good jobs, people who have good brains. I don't know who's brainwashed these people into how you don't raise kids nowadays. I guess it's Dr. Spock playing out. But anyhow, I said, so you get married, you have children, you set up rules. You have your own little domestic organization right there. Now I said, we have a church organization. I said, now what we do is we find the most mature spiritual minds in the conference, and these men will establish what are safe rules for our denomination. We elect them to that position, and then the conference probably votes on it. They do in ours. I don't know how they do it here. We call those resolutions. And we're not saying that you have to do that stuff to go to heaven. We're saying you have to do that stuff if you want to be a full member of this organization. There's a difference between belonging to a church and going to heaven. I know a lot of people that I don't agree with their standards. I have every confidence that I'm going to see them in heaven. They wouldn't qualify for full membership in my organization. Just as mom and dads set rules, churches have to set rules, or else membership doesn't mean anything. Let's just dissolve the whole organization and we'll all have pioneer churches and you can do whatever you want. Now, I don't think we want to do that. People who do that have a way of losing their bearing. Mavericks aren't really happy out there. You need discipline. You need accountability. It's good for you. That annual report you fill out, I saw out there in the hall, that's good for you. That gives you a sense that somebody's watching over your shoulder, and that's not all bad, friend. Wow, I don't have any of this in my notes today, Brother Sutherland. Will I get an extra tip for this? I'm working for you now here. We're talking about what is the goal of calling. That's where you deal with controversial subjects. Don't just talk them into doing certain things because you want them to do it. Now, there is a sense in which you must keep your people busy. Busy, or else someone or something is going to keep them busy. Someone said, Lord, help us to be as the children of Issachar, who were discerners of the time. You need to pay attention to what's going on in your church. You need to be aware of trends that are developing in your local congregation. You need to be cognizant of what's going on. Now, sometimes we can talk ourselves into thinking things are better than what they are. I heard about the fellow who went to an eye exam. Now, he knew he was needing bifocals. I don't know if it's an issue of pride or what, but there are people, now they tell you if you have bifocals, they can blur out that line so nobody will know you have on bifocals. That seems to appeal to the ladies. And then after a while, when you get trifocals, it's even worse, and they say, we can take care of that line for you, That's all right, I'll leave the line. Fellow went to get his eyes tested. He didn't want the bifocals. We don't want to admit we're getting older, do we? Another little sidebar here. I had several old-timers in my church that couldn't hear very well. So we ran a wire down to the front pew, and we had a little outlet where they could plug in headphones. You could hear everything. You could sit there and adjust the volume and make it so loud we could hear it coming out of the speakers there on his headphones. If you want to, sit there till your eyes are dancing. You think they'd use those headphones? No, sir. They'd sit in the back and not hear a thing rather than admit they needed the headphones. This guy didn't want the bifocals. So the optician is sitting there, he covers one eye, and they show him the chart. And they're asking him what he sees. Now, it's quite a guessing game. He says H, A, E, C. He's all done. He says, how did I do? Well, I said, you didn't do too well. I said, those were all numbers I was showing you. He didn't want to acknowledge that he needed a change in life. For him, it was bifocals. Doesn't the scripture say to examine yourselves? I'm trying to help you to think about examining yourself. In the college, everything is done by objectives and goals. I can't teach a course in any college or university or seminary without sitting down and making some goals and some objectives. That's the hard part. Once I've done that, then I order my textbook to help me meet those goals. I give my lectures to meet those goals. I develop my midterm and final exams and any papers I'm going to require to help support those goals. Everything feeds into supporting the goals. And that course then should help meet the college goals. Well, we should do that kind of thing in the church as well. Now, here's what I recommended for people to do. Pastors, what would be the best thing you could do? Sit down with your board and say, let's come up with 6 or 8 goals for our church for this year. Just talk about it. They probably never thought of it. They said, what do you mean? Our goal is to grow. Well, okay, well, we need goals on how we're going to grow. Oh, that sounds too formal. No, it's well to put these things down in black and white and look at them and think about them and pray about them. It might not be a bad idea to contact Brother Sullivan. Maybe the next time he comes by, you say, well, before we implement these, we want to talk to you. What do you think of our goals? Get him involved. The conference should have goals. You should sit down with your Sunday school teachers. I mentioned the other evening, my class leader at my last church happened to be my uncle, a godly old West Virginia hillbilly, but he loves people and people love him. That man has touched more lives probably than I have for Jesus, just doing and doing and doing for people. But I said, Uncle, you're the class. They've elected you class leader of this church. Let's get out the discipline and see what the class leader is supposed to do. He thought all they were supposed to do was call the service to order, and call on somebody to pray and listen for testimonies and just sort of conduct the service. Oh, no, I said, class leaders do more than that. Establish some goals. What do you want to accomplish in midweek prayer meeting? Are your evening services any different than your morning services? Do you know the difference between an evangelistic service and a worship service? There are song leaders that don't know the difference between a gospel song and a hymn. Sunday morning, not too long ago, I want to be careful here, I don't want you to track this down. Sunday morning in Sunday school, we started off with something like, "Take time to be holy." That is not a Sunday school song, friend. Okay? And Wednesday evening should be more devotional type songs. My Jesus, I love thee, Well, that might be a Sunday morning. And all these could be debated, I know. But several of the colleges where I've taught, I've sat down with the music teachers and I said, don't you tell these people the difference between a hymn, what's appropriate for Sunday morning, and what's an evangelistic song for Sunday night? Now maybe in the passing decades, maybe Sunday nights are not evangelistic services like they used to be when I was a kid. Everybody knew what kind of service we were going to get on Sunday night. And that's probably when you'd have the altar call, if there was going to be one. People should know. And just conducting a song service. I've told my song leader, now if you want the people to stand for a song, don't say, we're going to stand and sing number 200, and then the music starts and people look around and they start straggling to their feet. 2 or 3 jump up over here when they say, well, since they're up, we'll get up. I said, what you do is you say, we're going to sing number 200, and when the music starts, you say, let's stand as we sing it, and give them a little hand motion. It's like a magnet, just pulls them right up out of their seat. You got to try it sometime. We don't do it that way, though, do we? We say we're going to stand first, and nobody knows when to stand. Right? Well, I'm criticizing now. I think we could do better at that. And the poor song leader, he doesn't know. Half of them are up, and, some are blocking each other's vision, and they're not sure if they should be up yet or not. And then when they're finished singing the song and they're standing, he walks away from the pulpit and the poor people are just hanging there. You should tell them to sit down. Wow, what have I've gone off into meddling now, haven't I? I don't know what you're thinking of me. Well, somebody said some men preach better than they pray. Someone said you cannot substitute organizing for agonizing. God is pleased when we pray, even if it is brief. Sometimes we think we have to have a long-winded prayer or we don't bother. God is pleased with brief prayers. Sometimes you're in people's house. You know there have been some times I've been in someone's house where I haven't prayed. No, you say. You look like a prayerless kind of a guy, right? No, it's not that at all. If they're unloading the moving van, and you're standing there in the way or something like that, that's not a time to call them in for prayer or something. Suit your prayer to the occasion. Pray many short prayers during the day. Earnestness means more than the length of the prayer. Well, I see it's 12 minutes till 12. They've moved up the next service. Now, sister over here, Sister Sutherland, she's still twisting in the wind about this 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21:1. She has her pencil ready. She thinks I'm going to tell her right now, but I'm not going to. You don't think I'm going to tell you that now, so you can go home, do you? That'll come in the 1 o'clock service, Fred. I didn't just fall off the turnip truck yesterday. Let's stand together for prayer. Brother Greil, I'm sorry, a Bible expositor like you have to sit and listen to me ramble like this, but would you pray for us anyhow, brother?